I'm Mackenzie, 28, and every year our family gathers at Grandma Ruby's for Easter dinner. My brother Jason, 30, works at a prestigious tech company and never lets anyone forget it. This Easter, Ruby's dining table was a picture of perfection: ham, scalloped potatoes, and her famous deviled eggs. The conversation flowed until Jason leaned back in his chair and announced, "Not everyone can handle a real career in tech. It takes a certain kind of intelligence." I saw Grandma Ruby's expression shift from warm to something unreadable. What happened next changed our family forever. Before I continue, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and subscribe for more family stories that will surprise you, just like my grandmother surprised us all that day. I've been a kindergarten teacher for 6 years now. I love working with children, their curiosity, their honesty, and those magical moments when they grasp a new concept. My classroom is my happy place, decorated with colorful artwork and filled with tiny chairs that have hosted countless little learners. Growing up with Jason was challenging. 2 years older and seemingly light years ahead in our parents' eyes, Jason was the prototype of achievement. Math competitions, science fairs, coding camps, he excelled at everything technical while I gravitated toward arts, literature, and eventually education. Our childhood home was a museum of Jason's trophies and certificates. My artwork and creative writing awards were displayed too, but they never generated the same excitement from our parents, Eleanor and Richard. Our parents never explicitly said technology careers were superior, but their actions spoke volumes. When Jason got his computer science degree, they threw a massive party. When I graduated with my teaching credential, we had a nice dinner. Just nice. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Easter at Grandma Ruby's has been our tradition since before I can remember. Ruby, now 78, has hosted every year in her charming colonial home with blue shutters and a garden that blooms precisely in time for the holiday. After Grandpa George passed 5 years ago, we worried the tradition might end, but Ruby insisted on continuing. "Family traditions keep us anchored," she always said. This year's gathering included the usual suspects. Aunt Sarah, my mother's younger sister, and her husband Uncle Mark drove in from Connecticut. Their daughter, my cousin Lindsay, is a second-year medical resident who somehow manages to look immaculate despite her grueling schedule. She brought her husband Derek, a quiet architectural engineer who mostly nodded and smiled during family conversations. The youngest of our clan, cousin Hannah, was home from her freshman year at college, her hair newly dyed a subtle purple that she was trying to hide from Aunt Sarah. Grandma Ruby might appear to be a traditional grandmother with her perfectly set hair and collection of brooches, but those who know her well understand there's more beneath the surface. She has a sharp wit and observant eyes that don't miss much. While everyone else in the family seemed impressed by Jason's accomplishments, Ruby always showed equal interest in my teaching stories. We share a special bond that started when I was young. She would read to me for hours and taught me to bake her secret recipes. "Different minds create a balanced world," she often told me. The past year had been particularly challenging in my career. Budget cuts meant larger class sizes, fewer resources, and more administrative work. I was exhausted, questioning if I could sustain my passion when the system seemed designed to burn teachers out. Meanwhile, Jason's career trajectory continued its steep climb upward. He'd recently been promoted to senior software engineer at his company, a fact my parents mentioned during every family phone call. Jason's habit of dominating family conversations with tech industry jargon had intensified over the years. At Christmas, he spent 30 minutes explaining blockchain technology to our uncle who simply wanted to know if his online banking was safe. At my birthday dinner, he turned a conversation about my favorite movie into a lecture about digital streaming algorithms. Each time, our parents beamed with pride while the rest of us struggled to maintain interest. My resentment had grown alongside his ego, and my sense of self-worth had diminished in proportion. I found myself downplaying my career accomplishments around family, knowing they would never measure up to Jason's in their eyes. The joy I found in helping a child read their first words somehow seemed less valuable than helping a tech company optimize their user engagement metrics. The morning of Easter Sunday, I arrived at Ruby's house early to help prepare the meal. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and coffee as Ruby taught me how to glaze the ham with her special honey mixture. "How are those little ones of yours doing in school?" she asked as she expertly crimped a pie crust. "They're wonderful," I replied, feeling a genuine smile form. "Tommy finally learned to write his name last week. You should have seen his face, Ruby. Pure pride." "That's a gift you gave him," she said, patting my hand with flour-covered fingers. "Never forget that." For a moment, I felt my worth restored. In Ruby's kitchen, teaching was valuable work. "And how about that brother of yours? Still saving the digital world one line of code at a time?" There was something in her tone I couldn't quite identify, not sarcasm, but not pure admiration either. "Jason's great. Another promotion, another raise. Mom and Dad are thrilled." I tried to keep the edge out of my voice. Ruby just nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "Everyone has their season to bloom, Mackenzie. Remember that." As I arranged daffodils in the centerpiece, I held on to hope that this Easter might be different. Maybe this year, family conversation would be balanced. Maybe Jason would show interest in others' lives. Maybe my parents would ask about my classroom with the same enthusiasm they showed for Jason's coding projects. Hope is a persistent thing in the heart of a kindergarten teacher. We're trained to see potential, to believe in growth. But family dynamics are deeply rooted, and as I heard Jason's car pull into the driveway, I felt my shoulders tense instinctively, preparing for another holiday in his shadow. Ruby's dining room was transformed for Easter. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across her grandmother's china. The table was set with pastel linens and the centerpiece of daffodils and tulips I had arranged earlier. Crystal glasses sparkled, waiting to be filled with the sweet tea Ruby made by the gallon for family gatherings. The doorbell chimed at noon exactly, and within minutes the quiet house became filled with the cheerful chaos of family arrivals. Mom and Dad came bearing a basket of fresh rolls and a bottle of sparkling cider. Aunt Sarah and Uncle Mark brought their traditional deviled eggs and asparagus casserole. Lindsay and Derek contributed a gourmet cheese board that looked professionally arranged. Hannah carried in a homemade coconut cake that leaned slightly to the left but was made with obvious care. Jason arrived last, as usual, with an expensive bottle of wine and a small box of artisanal chocolates from a boutique shop in his trendy neighborhood. He wore a casually expensive sweater and his new smartwatch that he made sure everyone noticed as he greeted the family. "Sorry, I'm a few minutes behind," he announced to the room. "Had to finish reviewing some code that's launching tomorrow. Millions of users will be affected if we don't get it right." He delivered this information with the casual air of someone accustomed to work of great importance. Ruby accepted his gifts with a warm smile. "We're just happy you're here, Jason. Family time is precious." The initial hour was pleasant enough as we caught up on basic life updates. Uncle Mark had started golfing again after his knee surgery. Aunt Sarah was considering retirement from her administrative position at the community college. Hannah enthusiastically described her art history classes and the campus activism she'd gotten involved with. The atmosphere was light, conversation flowing naturally as Ruby brought out trays of appetizers. "These deviled eggs are amazing, Ruby," Derek commented, reaching for his third. "What's your secret ingredient?" "A dash of curry powder," Ruby winked. "And about 60 years of practice." As we settled around the dining table, Mom initiated the work update round that had become a standard feature of family gatherings. "Lindsay, how's the residency going? Still surviving those long shifts?" she asked as she passed the bowl of mashed potatoes. Lindsay sighed but smiled. "Barely surviving some days. Last week I worked 36 hours straight during a major trauma event. I'm learning so much, but the human body wasn't designed to stay awake that long." "That's incredible dedication," Ruby said. "Your patients are lucky to have you." Hannah shared her ongoing debate about declaring a major, torn between art history and environmental science. "I love both, but everyone says there are no jobs in either field," she said with the uncertainty typical of freshmen. When my turn came, I briefly mentioned the creative writing project my kindergartners had completed. 6-year-olds telling stories about what they want to be when they grow up. We published them in little books with their own illustrations. One wants to be an astronaut veterinarian who takes care of space dogs. Mom smiled politely. How creative. I hope they're also learning their math. That's so important these days. Before I could respond, Jason cleared his throat. The table instinctively quieted the programmed response to his conversational dominance. Actually, speaking of important skills, he began, setting down his fork with precision, I've got some pretty big news. My team's project was selected for accelerated development, and I've been named the technical lead. We're building an AI integration that's going to revolutionize how the platform predicts user behavior. My father leaned forward eagerly. That's fantastic, son. Will this mean another promotion soon? Very likely, Jason nodded with practiced modesty. The VP of Engineering has been mentoring me personally. He says my approach to quantum machine learning algorithms is refreshingly innovative. What followed was 15 minutes of technical jargon that left most of the table nodding politely while their eyes glazed over. Jason described neural networks, data architecture, and implementation strategies with the assumption that everyone found it as fascinating as he did. My parents asked follow-up questions that encouraged further elaboration, while Aunt Sarah valiantly tried to look interested. The salary band for the next level is quite competitive, Jason mentioned casually, though everyone understood this was the point of his extended monologue. Silicon Valley compensation packages are designed to retain top talent. My stock options alone from this promotion could potentially fund a very comfortable early retirement. I noticed Uncle Mark checking his watch discreetly. Lindsay was cutting her ham into increasingly smaller pieces, focusing intently on her plate. Derek had the vacant smile of someone who had mentally left the conversation. The familiar knot of frustration tightened in my chest. One mention of my classroom project had been swiftly overshadowed by Jason's career update. My parents' obvious pride in his accomplishments stung, especially compared to their polite but limited interest in my work. I pushed my potatoes around my plate, trying to maintain a pleasant expression. Ruby caught my eye from across the table and gave me a subtle, understanding nod. There was something in her expression I couldn't quite read, not just sympathy, but something almost like anticipation. The future belongs to technology, my father pronounced, raising his glass in Jason's direction. You're at the forefront, son. The conversation continued with Jason explaining how his company's technology would transform everyday life. I made several attempts to steer the discussion toward other topics, Lindsay's medical research, Uncle Mark's community theater involvement, even the unseasonably warm spring weather, but each attempt was short-lived before Jason reclaimed center stage. As Ruby rose to clear the dinner plates in preparation for dessert, I offered to help, grateful for a momentary escape from the table. In the kitchen, I exhaled deeply, letting my shoulders drop from their tense position. He certainly enjoys being the center of attention, Ruby observed quietly as she sliced her homemade apple pie. It's the same at every family gathering, I replied, trying to keep the bitterness from my voice. My entire career could fit into a 5-minute conversation slot, while Jason's latest app update requires a TED Talk. Ruby's eyes twinkled with something that looked almost mischievous. Sometimes people reveal only what they think others value, she said cryptically. Dessert might bring some interesting perspective. I wasn't sure what she meant, but her calm confidence was reassuring as we carried pie and coffee back to the dining room, where Jason was explaining to a clearly overwhelmed Hannah why she should consider switching her major to computer science. As dessert was served, the conversation shifted toward future plans. Hannah was enthusiastically describing her summer internship at a local art gallery when my mother redirected the focus. Speaking of future plans, she said, turning toward me, Mackenzie, are you still considering that master's program in education you mentioned last year? I was surprised she remembered. Actually, yes. I've been researching programs with evening classes so I can continue teaching full-time. I'm interested in curriculum development and educational psychology. There's so much new research about how children learn that I could implement in my classroom. For a brief moment, I had everyone's attention. Lindsay asked thoughtful questions about the research I found most compelling. Uncle Mark shared that his neighbor's daughter had completed a similar program and found it valuable for her teaching career. Even my father nodded with mild interest. That sounds challenging to balance with your teaching schedule, my mother noted. But I suppose education courses are more manageable than something like engineering or computer science. And there it was, the subtle comparison, the implied hierarchy of academic difficulty. I felt my face grow warm but maintained my smile. The coursework is actually quite rigorous. Educational neuroscience combines multiple disciplines and has practical applications that require careful implementation. Jason, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, set down his coffee cup with a definitive click against the saucer. He leaned back in his chair with the confident posture of someone about to deliver an important truth. Not everyone can handle a real career in tech, he announced. It takes a certain kind of intelligence and work ethic that's pretty rare. Most people don't have the analytical thinking skills or the stamina for the kind of work we do. That's why the compensation is so high. The talent pool is limited. The statement hung in the air like a heavy cloud. I felt as though I'd been slapped, the dismissal of my career so casual yet so complete. The implication was clear: teaching kindergarten didn't require real intelligence or work ethic. My face burned hotter, embarrassment mixing with anger. Looking around the table, I saw varied reactions. My parents looked uncomfortable but didn't contradict Jason. Aunt Sarah pressed her lips together in disapproval. Uncle Mark studied his dessert plate with sudden interest. Hannah's eyes widened in second-hand embarrassment. Lindsay shot Jason a sharp look, while Derek shifted awkwardly in his seat. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Lindsay spoke up. I'd argue that different careers require different kinds of intelligence, she said evenly. The emotional intelligence needed to manage a classroom of young children is substantial. Jason shrugged. Sure, different skills for different fields. I'm just saying that the technical complexity and intellectual demands in cutting-edge technology are objectively more challenging. That's why not everyone goes into it. Most people would struggle with the concepts I work with daily. I gripped my napkin under the table, knuckles white. 6 years of managing overcrowded classrooms, developing individualized learning plans, communicating with diverse families, mastering curriculum standards, and nurturing little humans through their formative years, all dismissed as not a real career requiring real intelligence. I opened my mouth to respond, a mix of statistics about teacher burnout and educational requirements ready to defend my profession. But before I could speak, I felt a gentle pressure on my arm. Grandma Ruby had placed her hand there, her touch calm and reassuring. Jason, Ruby said, her voice unusually firm, would you be a dear and help me bring something from my office? It's a bit heavy for me to carry. Jason looked surprised by the interruption but nodded. Of course, Grandma. As they left the dining room, an awkward silence descended. My father cleared his throat and mentioned something about the weather forecast for the week ahead. My mother began collecting dessert plates with nervous energy. Lindsay moved to sit beside me. You okay? She whispered. That was completely out of line. I nodded stiffly, blinking back tears of frustration. Just the usual Jason show. I should be used to it by now. You shouldn't have to get used to it, Lindsay replied. Your work is incredibly valuable. Anyone who's spent 10 minutes with young children knows it takes extraordinary skill and patience to teach them effectively. Hannah joined us, squeezing my shoulder. My favorite teacher was my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Wilson. I still remember how she taught us to read. She changed my life. Their support was touching, but the damage was done. Once again, a family gathering had reinforced the message that Jason's career was impressive while mine was merely nice. I wondered what Ruby was saying to Jason in private, probably gently reminding him to be more considerate of others' feelings. Ruby had always been diplomatic that way. When they still hadn't returned after several minutes, curiosity began to replace hurt in my mind. What could they be retrieving from Ruby's office? As far as I knew, she only used that room for paying bills and writing occasional letters to old friends. They've been gone a while, Aunt Sarah remarked, voicing what everyone was thinking. Just as Uncle Mark volunteered to check on them, we heard footsteps returning down the hallway. Jason appeared first, his expression unreadable but notably different, something between confusion and shock. Ruby followed, carrying a worn leather portfolio that looked decades old. "I think we need to clear these dessert plates," Ruby announced with unusual authority. "I have something to share with all of you." We quickly cleared the table as Ruby requested, curiosity evident on every face. Jason helped arrange chairs so everyone could see as Ruby carefully placed the old leather portfolio on the table. Her hands, spotted with age but steady, unlatched the brass clasp with practiced ease. "I've kept these for over 50 years, she said, her voice taking on a quality I'd never heard before, professional, almost scholarly. "I think it's finally time to share this part of my life with my family." She opened the portfolio to reveal yellowed technical documents, diagrams filled with complex notations, and black and white photographs protected in plastic sleeves. She selected one photo and placed it on the table where everyone could see. The image showed a young woman in her 20s standing proudly beside an enormous computer that filled an entire wall. The woman wore a professional skirt suit with her hair styled in a perfect 1960s updo, her expression serious but with a hint of excitement in her eyes. It took me a moment to register what I was seeing. "Grandma, is that you?" Hannah asked, leaning forward. Ruby nodded. "That's me in 1964 at IBM, standing next to the mainframe computer I programmed for nearly a decade. I was one of the first female computer programmers in the country." The silence that followed was profound. We all stared at Ruby, then at the photo, then back at Ruby. No one seemed capable of forming words. "I worked on early Fortran and COBOL systems," Ruby continued, pulling out more documents. "These are some of my original coding sheets. We didn't have screens back then, everything was done on paper first, then punched onto cards for processing." She laid out more photographs, Ruby surrounded by men in white shirts and narrow ties, Ruby receiving an award, Ruby pointing to a complex diagram on a blackboard. In every image, she looked confident and completely in her element. "I was recruited out of college because I had excelled in mathematics," she explained. "The space race was heating up, and computer programmers were desperately needed, especially those who could write efficient code for the limited memory systems of that era." My father found his voice first. "Mom, you never told us any of this. We always thought you were a secretary before you married Dad." Ruby's eyes twinkled. "That's what most people assumed when I said I worked at IBM. It was easier that way sometimes. But no, I was a senior systems programmer. These," she said, carefully extracting several formal documents, "are patents with my name on them for programming innovations." "Patents?" Jason's voice cracked slightly. He reached for the documents with newfound respect. "Yes," Ruby nodded. 3 of them, for memory allocation algorithms that were critical during the Apollo missions. My team wrote code that helped calculate trajectory corrections for spacecraft." She proceeded to show us technical journals with her name listed as author or contributor, certificates of achievement, and letters of commendation from supervisors. One by one, she constructed a picture of a brilliant technical career none of us had known existed. "During the height of the space race, I often worked 80-hour weeks," Ruby continued. "We were creating systems no one had built before, solving problems with no precedent. Everything we know today about computer architecture was being invented then, and I was part of it." My mother looked stunned. "Why didn't you ever tell us? All these years?" Ruby sighed. "It was a different time. When I married your father," she looked at my dad, "and then became pregnant, the expectation was clear: women left their careers to raise families. I was actually forced to resign. IBM had a policy then, they wouldn't employ married women." "That's discrimination," Hannah exclaimed. "That was normal," Ruby corrected gently. "I loved your grandfather and wanted a family. But I never lost my technical knowledge or my passion for problem solving. I just applied it differently." She turned to Jason, whose expression had transformed from shock to genuine interest. Jason, you mentioned quantum machine learning algorithms earlier. The mathematical foundations for those were being developed when I was programming. The binary logic gates that underpin all your coding work now, we implemented those physically with vacuum tubes and later transistors. To everyone's surprise, she began asking Jason technical questions about his current projects, questions that revealed a deep understanding of computer science principles. Jason struggled to answer some of her more probing inquiries, his confidence visibly recalibrating. The solid-state storage systems you take for granted, Ruby continued, we could only dream of those. We measured memory in kilobytes, not terabytes. I once optimized a program to save 14 bytes of memory, and my entire department celebrated because that was a significant achievement. She pulled out another document, a curriculum for a programming course. I taught programming at the community college for 3 semesters under a different name, Ruby Miller instead of Ruby Wilson, because your grandfather was concerned about appearances. But I couldn't stay away from it completely. The family sat in astonished silence as Ruby continued sharing her hidden professional past. She spoke about debugging systems by reading hexadecimal dumps, writing efficient sorting algorithms when processing power was precious, and the camaraderie of the primarily male team that had eventually accepted her as one of their best programmers. Different kinds of intelligence, Ruby said, looking meaningfully at Jason, are all valuable. The analytical thinking needed for programming is one kind. The emotional intelligence needed for teaching is another. The spatial reasoning needed for Derek's architectural work is yet another. The diagnostic reasoning Lindsay uses in medicine is its own form. None is superior, just different tools for different tasks. She turned to me with a warm smile. Teaching children to read, to think, to create, that requires extraordinary intelligence, patience, and skill. Arguably more complex than programming, because human minds are infinitely more variable than computer systems. Jason had the grace to look embarrassed. I had no idea, Grandma. This is incredible. You were a pioneer. I was one of many women who were there at the beginning, Ruby corrected. Many of our contributions were minimized or forgotten. The men got most of the credit and certainly all of the promotions. But we were there, writing the code that made history. My parents were examining the documents with expressions of disbelief and growing pride. All these years, my father murmured, and we never knew. Why reveal this now? Aunt Sarah asked. After keeping it private for so long? Ruby looked around the table, her gaze resting finally on Jason and then on me. Because I've observed a pattern in our family conversations that troubles me. Intelligence and contribution come in many forms. When we elevate one type of work above others, we diminish not just people, but possibility. The world needs programmers and teachers and doctors and artists. A society functions through diverse contributions. Jason couldn't take his eyes off a technical diagram Ruby had created decades ago. This algorithm structure, we're still using variations of this approach today. Some principles are timeless, Ruby nodded. Just like the principles of good teaching, good medicine, good art. The entire family dynamic had shifted in the space of 30 minutes. Ruby, our traditional grandmother who baked cookies and hosted holidays, had revealed herself to be a groundbreaking technologist who had helped shape the digital age that Jason believed belonged exclusively to his generation. For several moments after Ruby's revelation, no one spoke. The only sound was the gentle rustling of old documents as family members carefully examined the evidence of Ruby's hidden career. The shock was palpable, each person processing this dramatic revision to our understanding of our matriarch. My father broke the silence. I can't believe this, Mom. All these years, I thought you were just a... I mean... He stumbled over his words, clearly recalibrating a lifetime of assumptions. Just a housewife? Ruby supplied with a knowing smile. That was an important role too, Richard. I loved raising you and your sister. But yes, before that, I was part of the early computing revolution. Did Dad know? Aunt Sarah asked, carefully examining a photo of young Ruby in the IBM office. Of course, Ruby nodded. George was tremendously proud. He kept all these materials safe for me when I couldn't display them openly. He always believed there would come a time when my work could be acknowledged without social penalty. Jason, still studying the technical diagrams, looked up. These system architectures are incredibly sophisticated for their time. Some of these approaches weren't widely adopted until decades later. His tone had completely transformed, the condescension replaced by genuine professional respect. We were inventing the foundation of modern computing, Ruby explained. Without screens or debugging tools, we had to visualize the entire system in our minds. One mistake in thousands of lines of code could crash everything, and finding that mistake meant hours of painstaking review. Like finding a needle in a haystack, Jason murmured. Except the needle and haystack were invisible, Ruby added with a wry smile. Lindsay, who had moved closer to examine the documents, asked, "Did you write code for medical systems too? Early healthcare computing?" Ruby nodded enthusiastically. Yes. One of my later projects before leaving IBM was an early patient data management system for research hospitals. We were trying to create a way for doctors to track treatment outcomes across multiple patients. That's incredible, Lindsay breathed. Those systems eventually evolved into the electronic medical records we use today. Hannah had pulled out her phone and was recording Ruby explaining one of the diagrams. When I raised an eyebrow, she whispered, "For my history of technology assignment. Professor Jenkins won't believe this primary source." My mother seemed to be struggling the most to reconcile this new information. "Why keep this hidden from us, Mom? We would have been so proud." "Would you?" Ruby asked gently. "The world was different then, Eleanor. When I was young, women who seemed too intellectual were often considered unattractive, intimidating. When I became a mother, showing too much interest in work outside the home was seen as neglecting family. I compartmentalized my life to fit into the world as it was." But all those times Jason talked about his tech projects, my mother persisted, "You never said a word about understanding the concepts." "I was waiting for the right moment," Ruby replied, her eyes twinkling. "And listening is how you learn. I've kept up with technological developments over the decades through reading and online courses. The principles haven't changed that much, though the applications have expanded tremendously." Uncle Mark, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "Ruby, I've known you for 30 years, and I never had a clue. You've always seemed so traditional." Ruby laughed, a full, rich sound that filled the room. "Mark, who says a woman can't enjoy both baking pies and writing algorithms? I've never seen these interests as contradictory." As the initial shock began to wear off, more specific questions emerged. My father wanted to know about the hardware she had worked with. Lindsay was fascinated by the medical applications. Hannah asked about the social dynamics for women in early computing. Jason, meanwhile, had shifted from surprised to intensely curious. "These memory allocation techniques, they're elegant. We've got practically unlimited memory now compared to then, but the efficiency principles are still relevant. When you only have kilobytes to work with, you learn to be creative," Ruby replied. "We couldn't waste a single byte. Today's abundance of computing resources has some drawbacks. It can lead to inefficient code because optimization isn't as critical." I watched in amazement as my grandmother spoke Jason's language with fluency he hadn't expected, occasionally using technical terms I didn't understand. The dynamic between them had completely transformed, from condescending grandson and doting grandmother to colleagues discussing a shared profession. "Ruby," I asked during a lull in the technical conversation, "why did you choose today to reveal all this?" The room quieted, and all eyes turned to my grandmother. Her expression grew more serious. "Because I've watched family dynamics that trouble me," she said directly. "I've observed how certain types of work are implicitly valued above others in our conversations. I've seen Mackenzie's contributions minimized while Jason's are celebrated. I've noticed how career hierarchy has created unnecessary distance between family members who should be supporting each other." My heart swelled with emotion as Ruby continued. When I heard the comment about real careers in tech requiring certain kinds of intelligence, I knew it was time. That kind of thinking isn't just incorrect, it's harmful. It creates false hierarchies of human contribution. Ruby turned to Jason, her expression kind but firm. Intelligence comes in many forms, Jason. Your analytical abilities are impressive, but they're not superior to Mackenzie's talent for nurturing young minds or Lindsay's skill in healing bodies or Hannah's artistic perception. Different tools for different essential tasks. Jason's face flushed, but he nodded slowly. I understand. I never meant to suggest. Perhaps not consciously, Ruby replied. But we absorb cultural messages about which work matters most. Often, those messages align suspiciously well with traditional gender roles and power structures. The conversation continued as we collectively processed this revelation. My parents began asking more questions about Ruby's early life, filling in gaps in their understanding of their mother. Aunt Sarah admitted she had suspected something over the years, noticing how Ruby would sometimes comment on technical news with unexpected insight. I actually did know bits of the story, she confessed. Mom swore me to secrecy when I found some of her old technical journals in the attic as a teenager. But I had no idea about the patents or her role in the space program. As evening approached, the family had physically rearranged itself. Instead of the usual clusters, men discussing sports and politics, women catching up on family matters, we were grouped around Ruby's documents according to interest. Jason was deep in conversation with Ruby about early programming languages. Lindsay was examining the healthcare system documentation. Hannah continued recording snippets for her project, while Derek, who had been quiet, revealed an unexpected interest in the historical hardware specifications. The family hierarchy had visibly shifted. Ruby, always respected as our loving grandmother, now commanded a new kind of admiration. Jason's position as the family technical authority had been upended. And I felt a weight lifting as I realized my own career was being viewed through a different lens. Teachers are the backbone of our society, I overheard my father saying to my mother. Without good early education, none of the other careers would be possible. My mother nodded. I think we've sometimes taken Mackenzie's work for granted because teaching seems familiar. We all went to school, so we think we understand what teachers do. But the skill involved in managing 25 young children while developing their minds, that's remarkable. Their words weren't directed at me, which somehow made them more meaningful. This wasn't performative support, it was a genuine recalibration of respect. As I helped Ruby gather her precious documents, she squeezed my hand. Sometimes people need their assumptions challenged before they can see clearly, she whispered. Even the smartest ones. As the evening progressed, we moved to Ruby's comfortable living room with the portfolio of documents. Family members took turns examining different pieces of Ruby's technical past, exclaiming over discoveries and asking questions. The atmosphere had transformed from the tense dinner table dynamic to one of shared wonder and reevaluation. Jason had been unusually quiet for the past 20 minutes, studying a particular technical document with intense focus. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. He caught my eye across the room and gestured subtly toward the kitchen. I hesitated, then nodded and followed him. In the kitchen, away from the rest of the family, Jason leaned against the counter. For once, his confident posture was absent. That was unexpected, he said finally. Which part? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Finding out Grandma was a tech pioneer, or having someone call you out on your condescension? Jason winced. I deserve that. Look, Mackenzie, I owe you an apology. Just me? Not the whole family you lectured about real careers and real intelligence? The words came out sharper than I intended, years of accumulated frustration finding release. You're right. He ran a hand through his hair. I owe everyone an apology. But especially you. I've been dismissive of your work. For a long time. Yes, you have. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. Every family gathering, every phone call, somehow my teaching career gets minimized while your tech achievements get spotlighted. I know, and I'm sorry. I never meant to. Maybe you didn't mean to, I interrupted, but you did it consistently. Do you have any idea what it's like to love what you do, to pour your heart into it, and have your own family treated as less valuable than writing code for a social media algorithm? My voice had risen, and I saw our parents appear in the doorway, concern on their faces. Before they could intervene, Ruby appeared behind them and gently placed her hands on their shoulders. Let them talk, I heard her say softly. This conversation is overdue. Jason took a deep breath. You're right. I've been arrogant and dismissive. Seeing Grandma's work tonight, it made me realize how much I bought into this tech superiority complex. And how much I've used it to. I don't know, feel special, I guess. You are special, Jason, I said, my anger softening slightly at his vulnerability. You're brilliant at what you do. But that brilliance doesn't make my work, or Lindsay's, or anyone else's less valuable. He nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. I know that. Or I should have known it. But somewhere along the way, I started believing that technical skills were the only ones that really mattered in today's world. Where did that come from? I asked, genuinely curious. Was it work culture? Or did it start earlier? Jason was quiet for a moment. Both, I think. But if I'm honest, it probably started with how differently Mom and Dad reacted to our achievements growing up. My math competitions got celebrations. Your writing awards got polite acknowledgement. Our parents shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, but Ruby kept them from interrupting. That's not entirely fair, I said. They were proud of both of us. Yes, but differently, Jason insisted. And then the tech industry reinforced it. The salaries, the perks, the way people look impressed when you say you're a software engineer, it's validating. It made me feel like I'd chosen the right path. And maybe I needed to believe that, because there are other areas where I don't excel. This admission surprised me. What do you mean? Jason looked down. You've always had friends easily. People naturally like you. You know how to connect, how to make people feel comfortable and valued. I've never had that skill. My social life has always been challenging. Technical achievement became my identity because it was the one area where I felt confident. I felt a sudden shift in my perception of my brother. Behind the arrogance was insecurity I'd never recognized. I had no idea you felt that way, I said softly. You always seemed so confident in everything. That's the act, he replied with a sad smile. The truth is, I'm terrified of being average. In tech, I'm exceptional. In most other areas of life, not so much. Is that why you talk so much about work at family gatherings? To stay in your confidence zone? He nodded. Partly. And partly because I assumed everyone would be impressed and interested. It didn't occur to me that I was dominating conversations or making others feel less important. Our conversation was becoming more honest than any we'd had in years. Perhaps ever. Your work as a teacher. Jason continued hesitantly. I never understood the complexity of it. The emotional intelligence, the creativity, the management skills required to handle a room full of children while actually teaching them something. That's extraordinary, Mackenzie. And I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I felt tears threatening. Thank you for saying that. Grandma's right, he said. Different kinds of intelligence are all valuable. I got caught up in this narrow definition of what matters. The tech industry can be an echo chamber that way. I took a deep breath. I need to acknowledge something too. Part of my resentment comes from envy. Your career path is so clear, promotions, raises, concrete achievements. Teaching can feel thankless sometimes. The metrics for success are harder to measure. The compensation certainly doesn't reflect the importance or difficulty of the work. That's a societal failure, Jason said with unexpected passion. Not a reflection on your career choice. From the doorway, I heard a small sound and realized our parents were still listening, with Ruby standing behind them. I made eye contact with my mother, whose eyes were shining with tears. "We contributed to this," she said, stepping into the kitchen. "The way we celebrated your achievements differently. It wasn't intentional, but we did it." My father nodded soberly. "We bought into cultural messages about which careers had the most value. We were wrong, and we reinforced that message to both of you. I'm sorry." The four of us stood in Ruby's kitchen, decades of unspoken family dynamics finally brought to light. Then Ruby joined us, her presence somehow both comforting and commanding. "Every family develops patterns," she said gently. "The beauty of being human is that we can recognize patterns that don't serve us well and create new ones." Jason turned to me. "I'd like to create a new pattern with you, Mackenzie. One where we genuinely support and take interest in each other's work and lives. No hierarchy. Just siblings who respect each other's different paths." For the first time in years, I saw my brother without the filter of resentment. Just Jason, brilliant but also vulnerable, arrogant at times but capable of growth. I extended my hand, but he pulled me into a hug instead. "Deal," I whispered. When we returned to the living room, the rest of the family tactfully avoided commenting on our red eyes or the obvious emotional nature of our conversation. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. Lindsay caught my eye and gave me a subtle thumbs up. Hannah grinned broadly. As the evening continued, Jason surprised everyone by asking me detailed questions about my teaching methods and the challenges of early education. His interest seemed genuine, not performative. When I described a particularly difficult student situation I'd navigated, he shook his head in admiration. "I wouldn't have the first idea how to handle that," he admitted. "My debugging skills are useless with human emotions." "They're different skill sets," I agreed, without the defensive edge that would have colored such a statement hours earlier. For the first time in years, I laughed genuinely with my brother over a shared childhood memory. The weight of competition had lifted, allowing space for genuine connection to re-emerge. From her armchair, Ruby watched the family's transformation with quiet satisfaction, the portfolio of her remarkable past spread around her like evidence of a life fully lived, in all its complexity. As the evening deepened, we gathered more closely around Ruby in the living room. The formal Easter dinner had evolved into something far more intimate and meaningful. Ruby's technical documents and photographs were carefully arranged on the coffee table, each one a window into a past we'd never known existed. "Tell us more about the women you worked with," Hannah requested, sitting cross-legged on the floor near Ruby's chair. "Were there many of you in computing back then?" Ruby smiled. "More than most history books acknowledge. During World War II, women were the computers." The word computer originally referred to people who computed, mostly women with mathematics backgrounds. When electronic computers emerged, many of those women became the first programmers because they understood the mathematics involved. "Like the women in Hidden Figures," Hannah nodded. "Exactly," Ruby confirmed. "Though we were hidden in plain sight. We weren't secretaries, we were writing the code that made these enormous machines work. But in company photos, we were often labeled as office staff rather than technical team." Jason leaned forward. "What was the biggest technical challenge you solved?" Ruby's eyes lit up at the question. "We had a memory allocation problem during the Apollo Guidance System project. The entire computer had less memory than your smartphone has in a single app today, but it needed to perform critical navigation calculations. I developed a dynamic memory management approach that freed up resources in real time as different modules completed their tasks." "That's essentially garbage collection in modern programming," Jason noted with admiration. "A primitive version, yes," Ruby agreed. "Necessity drove innovation. When resources are constrained, creativity flourishes." "Did your programming background help you in other areas of life?" I asked, genuinely curious about how her technical thinking might have influenced her approach to family and community. Ruby nodded thoughtfully. "Absolutely. Programming teaches you structured problem solving. I applied those skills to everything from household management to community organizing." When I served on the school board in the 1980s, I approached district resource allocation the same way I once approached memory allocation, systematically, with clear priorities. The school board, my father exclaimed. I thought you joined that because you were interested in education. I was, Ruby replied. But my technical background gave me tools to analyze budgets and propose efficient solutions. We managed to save the music program by restructuring administrative costs using optimization approaches I learned in computing. I felt a growing appreciation for the complexity of my grandmother's life and mind. Did you miss programming after you left IBM? I asked. A shadow crossed Ruby's face. Every day, for years. It was like losing a language I loved to speak. But I found ways to keep those skills alive. I taught programming classes at the community college under my maiden name. I solved puzzles and logic problems. And I read technical journals to stay current. She reached for a particular photograph Ruby in front of a classroom of students, pointing to a blackboard filled with what looked like code. These were my students in 1972. Several went on to significant careers in technology. I like to think I helped pave their way. You were teaching while raising Dad and Aunt Sarah? My mother asked, clearly recalibrating her understanding of her mother-in-law. Ruby nodded. 3 evenings a week for 1 semester. Your father was wonderfully supportive, she added, addressing my father. He'd make dinner those nights and help with homework. He understood my need to keep that part of myself alive. My father looked stunned. I had no idea. Dad never mentioned it. We kept many things private in those days, Ruby explained. Social expectations were powerful forces. But George always saw me completely, both the mother and the programmer. He valued both equally. As the conversation continued, Ruby drew connections between her technical work and other aspects of her life, revealing a holistic perspective I found deeply compelling. Teaching requires the same structured thinking as programming, she noted, looking at me. You're essentially debugging young minds, identifying where understanding breaks down and developing targeted interventions to fix the problem. I'd never thought of my work that way, but the analogy was surprisingly apparent. I do spend a lot of time figuring out why a particular child isn't grasping a concept, then designing different approaches until something clicks. Exactly, Ruby nodded. Different syntax, same logical structure. To Jason, she added, and your work building user experiences requires understanding human psychology and behavior. It's not purely technical. The best programmers I knew were those who could think beyond the code to how humans would interact with the systems. Jason nodded thoughtfully. That's actually where I struggle most, predicting how users will behave. The code is logical, people aren't. That's where Mackenzie's expertise would be valuable, Ruby pointed out. Her daily work involves understanding how developing minds process information. The idea that our different professional skills might complement each other was a novel perspective. Jason and I exchanged thoughtful glances. As the evening progressed, Ruby shared more stories about her technical career, but also how those experiences had shaped her approach to motherhood, community involvement, and even gardening. Systems thinking applies everywhere, she explained. Once you learn to see the world that way, you recognize patterns and connections across seemingly unrelated domains. The conversation shifted to the present and future. Ruby surprised us by revealing she'd been taking online courses in current programming languages. Just to keep the mind sharp, she said with a wink. Python is quite elegant compared to what we worked with. You've been learning Python? Jason's jaw literally dropped. Grandma, that's incredible. Old dogs, new tricks, she smiled. The syntax changes, but the logical thinking remains the same. Hannah, who had been recording parts of Ruby's story, looked up from her phone. Grandma, would you be willing to talk to my Women in STEM group at school? Your story is exactly what we've been discussing in our History of Technology course. I'd be honored, Ruby replied. It's important for young women to know they're continuing a legacy, not starting from scratch. I think you should write your memoir, Lindsay suggested. These stories need to be preserved, especially the contributions of women that have been overlooked. Ruby considered this. Perhaps it's time. I've kept journals throughout my life. With some organization, they could become something more formal. Looking at me, she added, Mackenzie, your classroom should know that their teacher comes from a line of women who valued both technical and emotional intelligence. Would you like to have one of my awards to display? It might inspire your little ones to see that learning can lead in many directions. Tears pricked my eyes at the gesture. I'd be honored, Ruby. My students would love that. Ruby then turned to Jason. And you, my technical grandson, perhaps you could visit Mackenzie's classroom sometime? Show the children what modern programming looks like, plant seeds for future coders. Jason nodded enthusiastically. I'd love that. Maybe we could develop a simple coding game appropriate for kindergartners. That's actually a great idea, I said, genuinely excited by the possibility of collaboration rather than competition. Ruby sat back in her chair, satisfaction evident in her expression. Different forms of intelligence, different careers, all valuable. That's the message I hope this family carries forward. The world needs teachers as desperately as it needs programmers. It needs doctors as much as it needs artists. A functioning society requires all kinds of minds working on all kinds of problems. As the evening drew to a close, family members gathered their things, but with a reluctance that hadn't been present at previous gatherings. Something profound had shifted in our collective understanding of each other and of Ruby. My mother helped Ruby return her precious documents to the portfolio. Thank you for sharing this with us, she said softly. It changes everything. Not everything, Ruby replied. Just perspective. And sometimes, that's enough. A month after that revelatory Easter dinner, our family had undergone a subtle but significant transformation. The changes weren't dramatic or performative, rather, they manifested in small but meaningful shifts in our interactions and attitudes. Jason had called me weekly, a new pattern in our adult relationship. Our conversations no longer centered on his career accomplishments but expanded to include genuine exchanges about our respective professional challenges and victories. The competitive undercurrent that had characterized our relationship for decades had dissipated, replaced by something closer to mutual respect. Most surprisingly, Jason had followed through on Ruby's suggestion. He'd visited my kindergarten classroom to help introduce a simple coding game designed specifically for 5- and 6-year-olds. Using colorful blocks and basic sequencing concepts, he'd managed to translate complex programming principles into activities my students could understand and enjoy. Watching my tech-focused brother sit cross-legged on the reading rug, patiently explaining algorithms to excited children, had been both surreal and heartwarming. Your students are amazing, he'd told me afterward, genuine admiration in his voice. The questions they ask, so insightful. And the way you manage the classroom energy while keeping them engaged. I couldn't do that. Different skills, I'd replied with a smile. But they complement each other. Our family had created a group chat where we shared updates and articles of mutual interest. My parents had made a noticeable effort to show equal enthusiasm for my teaching accomplishments as for Jason's technical achievements. When I mentioned receiving a grant for a classroom library enhancement, they suggested a celebration dinner, the kind of response previously reserved for Jason's promotions. Ruby had embraced her newfound role as family truth-teller and wisdom keeper. She'd agreed to speak to Hannah's Women in STEM group, where her stories of early computing had captivated the young students. Several had requested interviews for their projects, and Ruby's calendar had filled with appointments to share her experiences with a generation eager to understand their technical formators. True to her word, Ruby had given me one of her Technical Achievement Awards to display in my classroom. I'd created a special shelf labeled My Grandmother the Computer Pioneer, surrounded by photos of Ruby with the enormous early computers. My students were fascinated, especially the girls, who asked endless questions about the grandma who talked to machines. The award had prompted valuable classroom discussions about different types of intelligence and the many ways people can contribute to society. Even young children, I discovered, absorbed cultural messages about which careers deserved respect and admiration. Challenging those assumptions early seemed particularly important. Ruby had begun organizing her journals and technical documents with Hannah's enthusiastic assistance. The prospect of a memoir had energized her, giving purpose to her meticulous preservation of her professional past. "Women's stories disappear when we don't tell them," she'd explained. "I kept mine private for too long." One particularly meaningful development had emerged from a conversation between Jason and Ruby about educational technology. Jason had identified potential applications of his company's resources for underserved schools, and with Ruby's encouragement, had initiated a pilot program at my school. The project would bring coding education to students who might otherwise lack access to such opportunities. "I think Grandpa would be proud of how his family has evolved," Ruby told me during our weekly tea time, now a cherished ritual. "He always believed that acknowledging the whole person, not just the parts that fit convenient social categories, was essential to true family connection." The lessons from our Easter revelation had rippled outward, influencing how we viewed not just each other but ourselves. I'd recovered a sense of professional pride that had been gradually eroded by years of subtle devaluation. Jason had developed humility and perspective that made him not less accomplished but more human. Our parents had confronted their unconscious biases about career prestige. And Ruby had reclaimed a vital part of her identity long kept in the shadows. The experience had taught us all several valuable lessons. Every career has unique value when pursued with passion and purpose. The metrics of salary and social status are poor indicators of a profession's true contribution to society. Families can inadvertently create hierarchies that diminish certain members while elevating others. Recognizing and dismantling these patterns requires honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to establish new dynamics. The older generations in our families often contain depths and dimensions we've never explored. Behind the familiar roles of mother, father, grandmother, or grandfather may lie remarkable stories and wisdom if we're curious enough to seek them. Sharing our vulnerabilities and insecurities rather than hiding behind achievement or bravado strengthens rather than weakens our connections with others. Intelligence manifests in countless forms, each valuable in different contexts. Emotional intelligence, analytical thinking, creative problem-solving, spatial reasoning, interpersonal skills all represent equally important capacities of the human mind. Perhaps most importantly, we learned that it's never too late to redefine family relationships. The patterns established in childhood need not dictate our connections as adults if we're willing to examine them honestly and create new ones intentionally. Ruby's technical legacy continues to live through both Jason's innovative coding work and my teaching, where I now incorporate basic programming concepts into my kindergarten curriculum. The false dichotomy between technical and nurturing careers has dissolved in our family consciousness, replaced by appreciation for the spectrum of human contribution. Ruby has begun writing her memoir, starting with the bold title, Hidden in Plain Sight, A Grandmother's Secret Life in Computing. Her story has already inspired several of Hannah's classmates to reconsider their assumptions about older generations and women's historical contributions to technology. As for me, I approach my classroom each day with renewed confidence in the value and complexity of my chosen profession. Ruby's award sits prominently on my desk, a daily reminder that teaching requires its own form of technical mastery, the intricate programming of young minds at their most receptive and formative stage. Our family Easter gathering will never be the same, and that's a gift we never expected but now deeply treasure. Have you ever discovered an unexpected talent or hidden history in an older family member? How did it change your perception of them and perhaps yourself? Share your stories in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more family revelations that might inspire reflection on your own family dynamics. Thank you for joining me on this journey of discovery, and may you approach your next family gathering with renewed curiosity about the depths that might lie beneath familiar surfaces.